I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
The American founders said that all men are created equal and are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They called this a self-evident truth. 87 years later, Abraham Lincoln reaffirmed this idea on the Civil War battlefield of Gettysburg. And in 1963, these same words echoed from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as Martin Luther King Jr. urged America to fulfill the promise of its founding. But humans are separated by enormous differences in talent and circumstance. Why would anyone believe that all men are created equal? That all should be free? That all deserve a voice in choosing their leaders? Why would any nation consider this a self-evident truth?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
For the millions around the world who have never tasted liberty, the question cries for an answer. How is freedom born? Babylon, Egypt, China, India, Greece, Rome. All the great empires of the ancient world rejected the idea of human equality. Even the great philosophers of ancient Athens maintained that humans are created most unequally, some to rule, others to serve.
Plato said people outside the Greek world, they're barbarians. They're not really as good or as human as the rest of us, so therefore they're worthy of being slaves. Aristotle said that slaves were slaves because they were incapable of self-responsibility, incapable of self-government. And in fact, this was the argument used to justify slavery for centuries onwards.
Greek power reached its zenith under Alexander the Great in 323 BC. Meanwhile, another power was emerging in the West, the Republic of Rome.
The entire Roman economy was built on slave labor. If you were born a slave, your average lifespan in Rome was about 20 years, and they were just simply worked to death. Roman civilization, despite all its glitz and glimmer and the great achievements that they made, had a very low view of human life and the value of human life. One example comes from an unimportant businessman by the name of Hilarion, who was on a trip to Alexandria and wrote a letter home to his wife.
Hilarion to Alice, his wife. Heartiest greetings. I beg and beseech of you to take care of the little child, and as soon as we receive wages, I will send them to you. If, good luck to you, you have a child. If it is a boy, let it live. If it is a girl, throw it out. You told Aphrodisias to tell me, do not forget me. How can I forget you? I beg you, therefore, not to worry.
Hilarion expresses his love for his wife, tenderness, compassion toward her, toward his son, which is the little child, and yet a complete disregard for the life of a daughter. Throw it out. Hilarion is a very good representative sample of the Roman view of human life.
Rome's power endured for almost 1,000 years. But in the 5th century AD, German tribes crossed the Rhine and eventually overthrew the city of Rome. So began the Middle Ages. For a time, Western civilization seemed to be dying. This was nowhere clearer than in the life of Cassiodorus. The Roman nobleman dreamed of founding an institution among the ruins of the fallen empire, a center of learning to preserve the best that had been thought and said. Another war forced him to flee, and when he returned years later, he built a monastery. There, as an old man, he finished his last work. It wasn't, however, an anthology of great writings. It was a spelling book. The reason was simple. His monks, the most learned men in the land, could no longer read the great books in their own library. It was an inauspicious time, and yet it marked the beginning of a civilization that would change the world.
With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Italy lay in ruin. But one of the great ironies of history of this particular period, one of the great comic reversals, is that this little band of monks, and not just this particular band, but monks all through Western Europe, not only did they engage in this civilizational enterprise of recapturing and reclaiming what had been lost from the classical period, they also went on, together with the inventors and the merchants and the lawyers of the Middle Ages, to go forward and build a culture that was going to surpass anything that had existed before it.
It was in these dark ages that a strange idea began slowly to take hold, the idea of human equality.
If we look at textbooks that cover this period, one of the interesting things is that we see the word slave disappear. It's almost as if it just vanishes into thin air and is replaced by the word serf or peasant.
Some people say, oh yeah, well they just changed the name from slave to serf. But that's a lie. Serfs were not free by our standards, but compared to slaves, they were very free. They could marry who they wanted to, they owed days of work, but they basically were in control of their own hours. No, it wasn't complete freedom, but it was very different from chattel slavery.
Masters still misused their servants, and yet in the winding course of the Middle Ages, the status of European peasants rose far above the status of slaves under the Roman Empire.
There's a growing sense of property rights, of rights to liberty. And as the Middle Ages goes forward, serfdom goes into decline. There were very few serfs left in Europe. By the 15th century, 16th century, serfdom is virtually eliminated.
Wow, slavery was gotten rid of in Europe. That's a story about slavery that is very seldom told, and it's a shame. Because what we can say about slavery is that until 700, 800, 900 in Europe, is it was universal. Everybody had slavery. Heck, there were many tribes of Indians, pre-Columbian Indians in North America who had slaves. All of the Northwest Indians along the Pacific were slave societies. Slavery was the rule. Christian Europe got rid of slavery.
The abolition of slavery in Europe was one part of freedom's march. The rise of democracy is another. This story begins in ancient Athens. The Athenians based their economy on slavery, but by the 5th century BC, they were allowing all free male citizens, some 10 to 15% of the population, into the governing process.
One of the great things about Athenian democracy was that it widened political participation. It widened it beyond the aristocracy. That did not exist in any other part of the Greek world, let alone the world that the Greeks called the barbarians.
This early experiment in democracy would inspire future generations, but the experiment itself proved unsustainable.
The question of whether the democracy in Athens is the forerunner of American democracy is a very important question. And too often people make the easy assumption that you can just move from one to the other and assume you're talking about the same thing. But that's predicated on some fundamental misunderstandings. Athenian democracy, which wild democracy, a democracy which could decide one thing today and another thing exactly the opposite the next day, without ever being responsible for its decisions.
It wasn't long before the citizens were themselves the tyrant. They put commanders to death without a fair hearing. They plundered the rich, and they crowned their guilt in one of the most infamous trials in history, the trial of the philosopher Socrates. Socrates was charged with refusing to recognize the official gods, with introducing new gods, and with corrupting the youth. All of this was based on little more than his association with the leaders of 2 coups, but it was enough. He was convicted and sentenced to death.
What's interesting is that when he was put on trial, Socrates couldn't appeal to a natural law or a divine law or something that was universal that the state had to live up to. The Athenian democracy that executed Socrates knew no higher law than the arbitrary whims of the majority of the population. That was a fatal flaw.
While the Greeks were discovering the limits of their democracy, the early Romans were at work building a republican form of government. It was a step toward government by the people, but only a step. Their system was closer to an aristocratic oligarchy, democracy for the few, and eventually, it began sliding toward an imperial dictatorship. Cicero, Cato, and others tried to resist the slide by grounding human rights in universal principles. They found these principles in a philosophy called Stoicism.
And they began to articulate things like the necessity for having our contracts enforced, the necessity for protecting our life, the necessity for protecting our labor and the acquisition of our goods, the necessity for having procedures to be able to vindicate our rights against our fellows.
The problem is, Stoicism was a very good philosophy on a lot of levels, but it simply did not shape the worldview of the Roman Empire enough to have much of an impact on the culture. It was essentially a philosophy of a small number of elites. On top of that, Cicero was heavily influenced by skepticism. So in essence, what he was saying was, you know, these Stoic ideas are really good and they make sense, and I think they're probably true, but we can't really be sure. And that's hardly enough of a firm philosophical foundation to build a complete revolution in the culture.
By the middle of the 1st century BC, Rome's attempt at representative government was crumbling. Cicero was slain as an enemy of the state, and his head cut off and displayed in the Forum. The empire would now be governed by a series of men who were treated as divine figures above the law. Emperor worship became the norm. The Jews, with their unbending religious scruples, were excused from this practice for a time, but the pull of history seemed to be against them. In 70 AD, Rome laid siege to Jerusalem. When it was over, nearly 1 million Jews were dead and the temple destroyed. "60 years later, the Emperor Hadrian slew another 580,000 Jews in a bloody effort to stamp out their religion. The Jewish scruple against emperor worship must have seemed a pitiful thing against such power, and yet, in the end, it was the Jewish view of imperial authority that prevailed. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. This growing religion carried at its heart the Jewish conviction that the emperor was only a man, and that he served under the authority of the one God. Now, the minority Jewish view was the dominant view.
After Constantine, there was at least an acknowledgement that there was a higher authority than the will of the king. Human nature being what it is, many kings and monarchs then claimed that their will was the same as the higher authority, that they were in fact the direct representatives of God. This, of course, is a distortion. But the Christian principle that the highest authority in the universe is the will of God and is not the will of the monarch, and furthermore that the image of God is in each man and is not just in the monarch, would eventually help to fight against tyranny.
At one level, the fight was a subtle battle of ideas fought over centuries, but at times it was the stuff of high drama. One such incident occurred during the reign of the Christian emperor Theodosius, late in the 4th century.
One of the effects Christianity had in the Roman Empire was the abolition of gladiatorial matches. Because of the Christian value of human life, killing people for entertainment was no longer acceptable. With the loss of gladiatorial matches, the next step was a rapid increase in chariot racing. Well, in the city of Thessalonica, when one of the prominent charioteers propositioned the young son of a Roman commander, he was arrested. The Thessalonian mob was so enraged by this that their hero on the tracks was under arrest, that they stormed the Roman garrison and killed the commander and his aides. The Emperor Theodosius heard about this and he decided he needed to do something about it. So what he said is that he was going to sponsor chariot races in Thessalonica. It was a ruse. When people came to show up for the races, instead of charioteers, they got Roman soldiers who slaughtered 7,000 people, men, women, and children, indiscriminately.
The slaughter was business as usual for Roman emperors accustomed to maintaining power with an iron fist. But what happened next would have been unthinkable under the old empire. One morning, soon after the massacre, Theodosius was about to enter the cathedral with his imperial entourage. He was met by Ambrose, the Archbishop of Milan. The priest refused Theodosius entrance into the church and commanded him to do public penance for his crime.
He said this on the front steps of the cathedral, in broad daylight, with the crowd surrounding him. And the amazing thing about this is that Theodosius complied. He dressed up as a pauper and stood on the steps of the cathedral several times over a period of months, proclaiming his guilt and asking for forgiveness. This is an unbelievable event. Earlier Roman emperors would simply have had his head removed, then and there on the spot, and walked into the church. No one challenged the emperor that way, publicly.
In the time of the day, what Ambrose of Milan did to him was revolutionary. It was like calling a god to account.
It was the first of many clashes between church and state.
The conflicts between the church and the state in the Middle Ages don't show either the church or the state at their best. You see self-serving churchmen and you see self-serving kings, each battling for power. But the very fact that the church could say, this authority rivals that of the crown, shows that there was a true principle at work, that the will of God is higher than the will of the king.
The fact that the church insisted on its independence, that the church was not simply going to be a department of political authority, created the social conditions for the possibility of free space throughout all society. Politics was not going to be allowed to fill up all of the space in society. Something else was going to be there. And when you have one something else there, namely the church, then other something else's, the family, the guilds of the Middle Ages, business enterprises, professional groups, etc., they find their space too. And suddenly we have this rich social mix, which is, in one respect, an essential condition for democratic self-governance.
In medieval England, a far-reaching effort to limit royal authority came during the reign of King John. The king had infuriated many of his barons by trying to handpick an archbishop, by trading land away to France, and by raising taxes to make up for the lost revenue. A group of barons and their knights entered London and pressed the king to parley with them on the field of Runnymede by the Thames. There in 1215 AD, they presented King John with the Great Charter of Political Liberty, the Magna Carta. At the center of the rebellion was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton.
The Magna Carta articulates rights, political rights that we take for granted. The right of the English Church to be free from interference by the monarch and by the state. The right of taxation by consent. The right of trial by jury. The right of habeas corpus. There had to be a reason given for arrest, and it had to be defensible. The Magna Carta is a fundamental document of our governmental system. Its principles are re-articulated throughout Anglo-American history on many occasions. It is the mother document of all of our political documents to follow, including the English Bill of Rights, the American Constitution, the American Bill of Rights, etc. It was that charter that was probably drafted by Stephen Langton. Stephen Langton actually organized the barons to parley with the king. He was the man of action at that place and at that time.
Stephen Langton appealed to the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament who were constantly confronting kings about their misbehavior. And to Jesus' words, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar and give to God the things that are God's. Now, Langton interpreted that as saying that Caesar does have authority, but his authority is not absolute. He has to give to God the things that are God's, and as a result, there are automatic limitations on royal power.
The Middle Ages once were depicted as a benighted sleep before the Renaissance. But there is now a broad consensus among historians that medieval Europe was an age of profound transformation. Slavery gave way to serfdom. The Church wrestled its independence from the kings of Europe, and a strong middle class emerged from an economic and technological flowering without precedent.
The Dark Ages are alleged to be from about the fall of Rome to the so-called Enlightenment of the 15th century. Well, I was raised on the Dark Ages. I think most of us were. But it's a lie. Let's look at the world, Europe, in the year 500, fall of Rome. What can we do? What do we know? What kind of technology? What kinds of ships and whatnot? And then let's go look at, the year 1400. And what do we have? And what you have is this incredible thing. Technologically and in a lot of other ways, like in the arts and literature, here's the year 500, here's the year 1400, but that was supposed to have been the Dark Ages. Well, how did we do that? In 2 weeks at the end of the Dark Ages? I mean, it's just silly.
In the Roman Empire, cheap slave labor and the heavy hand of the state discouraged the invention of labor-saving devices. But in the medieval period, the spirit of innovation flourished. First in the monasteries, then in the city-states of northern Italy, and eventually across Europe. During the early, high, and late Middle Ages, Europeans invented or advanced an array of technologies. The heavy-wheeled plow for working dense, fertile soil the Romans had avoided. Harnesses for large teams, improved roads for wagons. Wagons with brakes and front axles that could swivel. Horseshoes, the three-field system, water power, chimneys, textiles and eyeglasses, a system of branch banking and insurance that accelerated commerce and trade. Plate armor, cannons, the knight upon horseback, the compass, the round ship for sailing the high seas, polyphonic music, a system of music notation, thin stone walls with stained glass, and with them the soaring Gothic cathedrals of the High Middle Ages.
It just goes on and on and on. You know, I mean, there's kind of no end to it. You know, it's the world of 1400 compared to the world of 500, and everything that was different had happened during those dark ages.
As capitalism and the spirit of enterprise spread outward from northern Italy, it found fertile soil among the Dutch and English. Here, entrepreneurs in the wool industry thrived under systems of government that allowed them to reap the rewards of enterprise.
They could create new machinery. They could set up farms that did things in new ways, precisely because there were commercial legal codes that protected their behavior. There were property rights that ensured that what they produced could not be arbitrarily taken away from them, that give them the confidence to know that their experiment, the capital that they invent, the ideas that they have, will pay off for them in the long run.
In England, Flanders, and across Europe, this groundswell of innovation created a sense that inventions were possible in every walk of life, which led to still more innovation. It was in this optimistic climate, around the year 1440, that a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg converted a wine press into a printing press. It changed the world.
The invention of the printing press made discussion global. It took the discussion of particular theological ideas and eventually particular political ideas out of the realm of each nation state, of each city, of each university, and it made these ideas something which could be disseminated across the world.
When in 1517, a German priest named Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses disputing church doctrine, the list was soon printed all over Europe, sparking the Protestant Reformation. Like Christian thinkers before them, the leading reformers emphasized theological principles that encouraged increasing political freedom.
The Protestant reformers emphasized that every person is at once a sinner and a saint. The notion that the person is a sinner is the foundation for the need to put safeguards, constitutional safeguards, on offices of authority or power to ensure that parties don't, when they come into those offices, convert them into instruments of self-gain or self-aggrandizement and, God forbid, tyranny. And as saintly creatures, we have basic rights that God gives us. And here the Protestants took the tradition's understanding of the notion that we are image bearers of God, that we exercise God's sovereignty. And in exercising sovereignty, that person will, at minimum, participate in elections, will participate in holding their authorities accountable for what they do.
The followers of reformer John Calvin used these principles to pioneer what came to be known as the social contract.
After finding themselves under persecution, Calvinists in the 1550s through 1590s began to develop the idea that communities are formed by social contracts, and the notion is that the rulers will exercise certain basic powers over the community and its people, and that the people will have certain basic rights and liberties guaranteed to them, which cannot be trespassed by the authorities.
These ideas crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower in 1620. When the Pilgrims arrived in the New World, they drew up an agreement based on principles they had learned as Puritan Calvinists in England. The result was the Mayflower Compact. Other Christian groups fleeing persecution soon followed them to the New World. The governments they established were based on principles that had been working their way into European culture for more than 1,000 years. But in the New World, the colonists were free to move forward rapidly in what came to be known as the American experiment. Many of the ideas that fueled this period of political innovation were distilled in the influential writings of 17th century political philosopher John Locke.
It's important to remember that John Locke is a cradle Calvinist. He learns basic Calvinist political theory as part of his basic upbringing. He spends time in the Netherlands, a haven of Calvinism among other faiths, and spends time in the Leiden coffee houses learning about what toleration means, about what social contract means, about what natural rights mean, about what the laws of nature entail. And I dare say that a number of his basic ideas are simply genetic reflexes born of his Puritan heritage. Part of those are an ingenious repositioning of those Calvinist ideas so they become palatable to an Anglican and a Royalist community.
By the middle of the 1700s, English settlers had established 13 colonies stretching from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south. The colonists had generally been loyal to England, but tensions were growing. War broke out in 1775. The following year, representatives from the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia, and on July 4th, signed a Declaration of Independence from England. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
The idea that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain rights is not at all a new idea. It is, in fact, as the phrasing indicates, it is in the creation story. God put His image in man. It is in the Old Testament accounts of Israel trying to find justice for the poor. It is in the minor prophets. It is in the New Testament when Paul says, Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, we are all one in Jesus Christ.
The Treaty of Paris brought the American Revolution to a formal end in 1783. The U.S. Constitution was ratified 5 years later. It was designed to check the threat of tyranny from either the one or the many.
James Madison, one of the chief architects of the Constitution, recognized as a Christian that because man is sinful and fallen, no individual, no group can be trusted with unchecked power. So Madison and the other American founders established a government where the rights of individuals would be protected against tyranny by a system in which there would be checks and balances.
Many were especially eager to establish freedom of religion. Their ancestors had come to the New World to escape religious persecution, but upon arrival had begun persecuting other religious groups. The founders hoped to put an end to this. They wanted to inscribe in law what they viewed as fundamental to true religion, the principle that faith cannot be coerced. As American founder George Mason wrote in the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776, religion or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. When the founders drew up the Bill of Rights in 1789, the first line of the First Amendment guaranteed freedom of religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The world's first constitutional republic had been born, and yet there lay at the heart of the new nation a contradiction. The United States declared that all men were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, but it did not extend those rights to America's slaves. The new nation was perpetuating the sins of its forebears. Although Christian Europe had gradually abolished slavery during the Middle Ages, Europeans had returned to it during the Age of Exploration, enslaving both Africans and the indigenous peoples of the New World. For many in both the Old World and the New, This revival of slavery flew in the face of the doctrine that humans are made in the image of God. The Englishman who took up the challenge was an unlikely hero. A young member of Parliament, William Wilberforce was a small, sickly figure who enjoyed the life of a gentleman. But on a return voyage from the European continent in 1784, he read Philip Doddridge's Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul, alongside passages from the New Testament. The return voyage was the beginning of a spiritual journey for Wilberforce. He resolved to commit his life to the service of God. He considered the priesthood, but friends encouraged him instead to serve God as a member of Parliament. He soon found his calling.
When Wilberforce started his campaign against the slave trade, I think any informed observer would have given him about 0% chance of success. Britain was wealthy and powerful, and a lot of that was based on their control of the slave trade. It was an absolutely impossible task by any standards.
Wilberforce made his first parliamentary speech against slavery in 1789. In the next decade, he submitted numerous bills against the slave trade. All of them were voted down. Wilberforce pushed on. He employed new tactics in the kind of bills he introduced. He published a series of pamphlets railing against the evils of slavery. Finally, in 1807, a bill abolishing the slave trade passed by an overwhelming majority. With the African slave trade abolished, Wilberforce turned to the abolition of slavery itself. In 1823, he published a treatise arguing that it was Britain's duty before God to free the colonial slaves. Declining health forced him to retire from Parliament in 1825, but from his home at Mill Hill, north of London, he continued to press for emancipation. In June of 1833, just 3 days before he died, a bill paying slave owners to free all slaves in the English colonies received its third and final reading in the House of Commons. "Thank God," Wilberforce said, "I have lived to witness a day in which England is willing to give 20 million sterling for the abolition of slavery." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Christian abolitionists in the United States were making a similar appeal. In books, pamphlets, newspaper articles, and speeches, they argued that slaves, humans made in the image of God, were being treated worse than livestock. During this period, even many Northerners opposed abolition. Abraham Lincoln initially sought only to limit the spread of slavery, convinced that nothing more was politically feasible. But the outbreak of the Civil War and the powerful words of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and other abolitionists prepared the way for bolder action. In the autumn of 1862, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward and forever, free. The news rushed through the plantations of the South, but the war raged on. In March of 1865, in his second inaugural address, Lincoln spoke of slavery, of America's original sin, in the context of God's providence and judgment. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Lincoln would be assassinated 41 days later. But from the ashes of the Civil War came the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These provided the constitutional grounding for a civil rights struggle that persisted for another 100 years. It was a struggle to honor and practice that self-evident but most elusive truth described in the Declaration of Independence.
When Jefferson declared that all men are created equal and that this was self-evident, he was speaking a truth that was beyond his experience and was beyond the experience of any country up to this point. So even when Jefferson said it, I don't know that he believed it. He gave intellectual assent to it, but the spiritual, the emotional, the practical outworking of this took centuries more, and in fact is still being worked out.
People have looked at, in numerous instances of Christians murdering, owning slaves and saying, well, these people are obviously hypocrites. But that's the point. They're hypocrites. They're not acting consistently with what their own belief system is telling them to be the truth about themselves and the truth about humanity as a whole. People like Plato and Aristotle could not be accused of being hypocrites because they didn't believe, or at least pretend to believe in the first place, that all human beings were created equal in the sight of God. That's the difference. Christianity gives people, even people who would consider themselves to be very secular, it gives people today the capacity to critique ourselves, to critique our behavior, and to design better institutions and to behave in better ways so that we live up to what the Judeo-Christian tradition tells us is true about the nature of human beings.
The American Revolution was led by men who spoke of unalienable human rights while owning slaves. And yet their revolution led to a government marked by the rule of law and increasing political freedom. Across the Atlantic, another political experiment, the French Revolution began as a courageous uprising against tyranny, but ended in a series of massacres, bloody internal purges, and the military dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. 19th century French political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville tried to identify what had made the difference between the two revolutions. He attributed the success of the American Revolution to many factors, but he argued that America's faith in a divine moral order played a decisive role, calling them toward principles that transcended political fashion.
The American Revolution wasn't to create new ideals and principles. It was to insist on fidelity to old ideals and principles that were being run roughshod over by the British Crown. The French Revolution, radically different. They wanted to overthrow the past. The old principles of the Christian heritage were not good enough for the French revolutionaries. They wanted something new under the sun, an entirely new order. Well, what did we get? The American Revolution brought us democracy and political and personal liberty. The French Revolution brought us murder, the guillotine, the terror.
The French Revolution became a revolution of successive seizures, where the revolution begins to consume its own. Because this is what tends to happen with truly radical revolutionaries. They're suspicious of any and everyone. And unless one exactly toes the line, one then falls under condemnation and sentence. And that's what they began to do. They began to execute one another.
The fundamental difference between the American Revolution over and against the French Revolution was that the French Revolution had no moral order beyond convention, beyond consensus of the National Assembly. When you take God out of the picture, You take this notion of higher law, of the whole framework for ordered liberty out of the picture.
When George Washington in the first inaugural says to the people of the United States that there could be no public happiness without private morality, he says what sounds like a counterintuitive thing. You would think we get a sound state, then people can be decent. He said, no, you got it backwards. A sound state depends on a decent people. Nobody ever said anything like that in France.
Although the early stages of the French Revolution were supported by many Catholics, the revolution eventually was dominated by men who sought to jettison the nation's religious heritage. To make their intention clear, they proclaimed a goddess of reason on November 10, 1793, and placed her personification on the high altar of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. One finds a similar, if less theatrical, impulse at work among the framers of today's European Constitutional Treaty, the central document of the European Union.
In 2003-2004, there was a fierce debate in Europe over the preamble to a new European Constitutional Treaty to govern the newly expanded European Union. And the fight was over whether Christianity could be cited as one of the sources of contemporary Europe's commitment to human rights, democracy, the rule of law. And the decision was no, you couldn't do that. That was either exclusive or that was offensive to other religious traditions, or that it simply wasn't true, that the Christian history of Europe had nothing to do with 21st century Europe's commitments to all of those good things. Now, this is preposterous in the extreme.
What has happened has been a systematic campaign to reinterpret our past as if it meant to disallow free expression of religion.
Think of what a scandal it would be if we were to say the abolitionists should have kept their Christian faith out of the struggle against slavery. Reverend Martin Luther King should have kept his Christian faith out of the struggle for civil rights. People who fought against abuses of women and children should have kept their religion out of public life. People who fought against the terrible crimes committed in the name of eugenics should have kept their faith out of politics. If we were to lose that in our public life, if we were to, in effect, establish secularism as the governing religion, we would be putting in place of the civil public square in which all voices, including religious voices, are welcome, a kind of tyranny. A kind of tyranny where an elite, secularized elite, is given control over public policy making, pushing the rest of the people out of the way and undermining our democratic Republican form of government. Now, we really shouldn't want that. Secularists themselves shouldn't want that. It's not fair, it's not right, and it's a fraud.
There are two buildings in Paris that, in a special way, sum up the argument over religion in public life in the West today. One of them is called the Great Arch of La Défense. It's France's official memorial to the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789. It's a colossal, striking, 40-story tall, white marble-faced, open cube. Down the river is the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which does not have regular features. One tower is shorter than the other, the gargoyles are all different, the glass is of very different colors. The shapes of the glass, the shapes of the stone are all different. And I think that's a reflection of a great respect for the diversity of human experience. And ultimately, it's a respect for the creativity of God, who did not make us all according to one single, mechanistic, replicable template. And the question when you're pondering these two buildings emerges, which culture would better protect the human rights that the great Arch of La Défense wants to celebrate? That featureless, geometric, rationalist cube, or the culture that produced the stained glass and the stone, the holy unsameness, if you will, of Gothic cathedrals like Notre Dame?
Some people seem to think that the way to defend principles of freedom and democracy is to appeal to moral relativism. The idea that we ought not to be imposing our values on other people because, after all, there is no moral truth, there are only subjective opinions. What's amusing about that is that it is the worst possible way to defend the ideals of freedom and democracy, because moral relativism, if it does anything, undermines those ideals. If all things are relative and matters of subjective opinion, then the belief in the dignity of the individual, the belief that people ought not to be enslaved, the idea that people should have their freedom respected, the idea that all citizens should participate in government and have a right to, the democratic ideal, all of those would be undermined. There would be no reason for believing those. The contrary opinions of Stalin or Hitler would have just as great a claim to governing, to ruling, as our own claims for democratic freedom and liberty. If freedom and democracy are in fact defensible, then it's not because there is no absolute truth. Rather, it's because that is the truth. The truth about man is that man has a special dignity that requires that his fundamental freedoms be respected and that he be entitled to participate as a full citizen in the affairs of the community.
The history of the West is filled with stories of violence and oppression, of racism and sexism, of noble ideas twisted into the service of cruelty. Such evils are, of course, larger than the West. They are the story of the human race. The mystery for historians is not that such evils persisted. The mystery is that from the base stuff of human nature, political, economic, and religious freedom were born in the West.
What we need to understand is how Western culture came to be one that favored all of these things. Well, some people suggest that we got where we are because of geography, that we were not in the disease belt, and that we had good land and plenty of rainfall, and that we just lucked out. The problem with that is civilizations have risen and fallen around the world, and there was a time when China was ahead. The geography didn't change to pull them back. People say, well, it was steel, or it was sailing ships, and it was agriculture. But those are part of the thing we're trying to account for. Everybody had astrology, but nobody else got astronomy. Everybody had alchemy, but only the West got chemistry. Alfred North Whitehead, in a lecture at Harvard in 1925, put it beautifully, shocked his audience. Shocked his old co-author back in England, Bertrand Russell, who was busy being a professional atheist. But he said, it's because they thought that the universe did have rules, that these rules could be discovered because God was rational, that they went and looked for the rules. And of course, the more remarkable fact is they found them. It's pretty amazing. And it does come back to what we think about God. The rise of science, the rise of civility, the end of slavery, all of these things has to do with the fundamental conception of God. An image of God as rational, as just, as loving.
The question is, where did Europe learn its dignity? Where did European men and women learn that they were people of inalienable or inherent dignity and value, who had a right to be consulted about how they were ruled? Where did Europe learn that the prince is also subject to the law? Where did Europe learn that there was a moral law written on the human heart? Moral truths that we can know by reason. Where did Europe learn that persuasion is better than coercion in the doing of the public business? One answer to that is that it learned it only in the Enlightenment, only in the 17th century and the subsequent history embodied by the French Revolution. I think that's a desperately foreshortened and truncated answer. European humanity learned its dignity in the school of Christian freedom, in the rich social pluralism of the medieval world, in those biblical stories we see in the glass of Notre Dame, which taught European men and women that they were made in the image and likeness of God, that they were somebody, not just something. To understand how the freedom project in the modern world emerges not in China, not in India, not in the Islamic world, but in Europe, and in Europe's child, America, then we have to come to grips with the biblical part of the foundation of Western civilization.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's cry. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free